following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. Dave Witty is calling on Nanaimo to recognize homelessness as an existential crisis. Witty brought a motion before City Council this month that included a call for Nanaimo to adopt Housing First Plus as the foundational element of a homelessness strategy. He sits on the Mayor's Leaders Table and has been exploring the response to homelessness in Switzerland. He joined me in the CHLY studio.
Dave Witty, former provost, VP academic at VIU. I still have an attachment to the Master Community Planning Program there, where I'm Senior Fellow of Urban Design and stay connected with students, supervise some of them. So still active in my profession, which is urban planning and urban design. Former Dean of Architecture, University of Manitoba. Before that, in practice for a long time in Winnipeg, Saskatoon, and out here on the coast as well with a firm called Urban Systems.
And with that background, what has got you into maybe this advocacy, this research, this pushing for change on this issue?
Good question. So one of the things I've done my whole career is observe and travel a lot. And I'm what I call an urbanist. So I explore cities. I see cities as literally ecosystems and complicated places with all kinds of interconnections. And I've had the privilege of going to Switzerland for the past 7 years yearly, and usually go for a month, usually in 6 weeks. And around 2020, I thought, I don't see a lot of homeless people yet. I've seen the number increase in Nanaimo or not. I live downtown over in Cameron Island, and so I'm downtown just about every day and walking around and heading to the vault for coffee and that sort of thing. And I kept seeing more and more homeless, and I thought, oh, that's odd. I wonder what that's about. So going to Switzerland, I thought, I don't see any homeless people. So literally in 7 years, I've seen one shopping cart with stuff in it, and traveled all over Switzerland. Primarily focused in a place called Basel, 174,000 people. Nobody sleeping in the parks. No drug use that you can see. So when I went back last year, 2023, I thought, okay, I've got to explore this in more detail. So I set up meetings with city people, university people, and it turns out the expert on homelessness in Switzerland that I was referred to. Interviewed him. The more I talked to people, the more I understood that they have no homelessness because they are diligent, focused, and have what's called Housing First Plus. And so I thought, okay, I need to explore that in detail, which I did. And it led me to believe that there are solutions out there. And then through further research, discover Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, Portugal really don't have a homeless population. In fact, most people who go to Europe come back and they say to me, boy, I didn't see very many homeless, no matter where you go, Italy, wherever. I mean, there are certainly some homeless, but not to the extent we have here. We have 1% of our population in Nanaimo homeless. In Switzerland, it's 0.02%. It's marginal. 2,200 people were identified as homeless in Switzerland in 2020 out of a population of 8.65 million people. So I said to myself, they're doing something right here. And I'm going to find out what they're doing. And that's how I built my practice, very successful practice over the years in urban planning and urban design, by taking lessons from elsewhere and suggesting them to clients and cities, and that maybe we should explore that here. And often people said, yeah, good idea, let's do that. So here we sit with me advocating for Housing First Plus in Nanaimo, for British Columbia, but there's just not much uptake.
When you say Housing First Plus and you talk about it being applied in Switzerland, what does that look like? What does that mean? And how would you translate that to Nanaimo if you were suddenly in charge of pulling all the strings, including the purse strings?
Yeah, I know it's a good question. So I think there probably four key elements. One is keep people housed. Swiss are all over that, as are the Finns, all the other countries that have low numbers, because the focus there is to keep people moving onto the streets, because once they get on the streets, there's all kinds of elements there that they can succumb to, including drug use, which they might not have had the will, desire, or need to use if they were housed. So the focus there is very much on keeping people in their houses first. Basic, 101, right? Keep people housed. They're not going to be on the street, so that makes sense. The second thing is that Housing First talks about providing housing of all types for people in need. So now if we're talking about people that are actually on the street, they're all individuals. They all have their particular quirks. They're all particular needs. They're all particular requirements. So they're treated individually. They're actually called clients, and they spend time identifying what are their needs, and then they provide them a particular housing that's needed for them. And so that's the Housing First side of things. So providing housing, all kinds, for all age groups, all needs. And then thirdly, wraparound supports, absolutely essential. So you can't just provide them with housing. You have to provide individuals the particular needs that individual has to actually transition back into what we would call a normal life. And many of these people can, and there are numbers in Europe. There's one study in Italy where 85% of the people who were taken off the street ended up back in society with jobs, paying taxes, and being just like the rest of us. 85%, because they provided in Italy the right wraparound supports once they took them off the street and assisted them. And some of those are lifelong supports, but not for everybody. Some are able to actually adapt fully back and don't need supports for the rest of their life. Some do. So that's the third element. The fourth is called the 4 pillars. And this is an interesting one. It comes out of Switzerland. It's applied across Europe, everywhere now. And it had to do with, in the 90s, Switzerland had an incredible heroin epidemic. And in one instance, in Zurich, Main Park downtown, there were 3,000 heroin users. Unbelievable. And it was just a disaster. Made the front page of the New York Times as people laughing at Switzerland because they had this addiction problem, didn't know what to do with it. So they sat down and said, well, we got to do something. And they developed what's called the 4 pillars. So the first of that is harm reduction, just trying to prevent the harm people are doing to themselves. And once you get to that, the second point is preventing further harm reduction. Third, treatment, long-term treatment for some, short-term for others, depends. And then fourth is enforcement. And enforcement is about law enforcement. It's about prevention of illegal drugs. It's about, for instance, the type of housing. This is an interesting one. So there are some people who need to wean off their drug use, or alcohol use, the case may be, but usually drug use. They need to wean off it. So they're provided in an accommodation where it's a site where it's safe drug use, and they're monitored, and they're moved towards the prevention side and the treatment side. And so that's a dedicated building. Usually it's about 30 people, no more than 50 for sure, and given the support. But then there'd be somebody else who says, you know what, if I end up there, I'm never stop. I've got to be in a dry house. And so they're placed in an accommodation where no drugs or alcohol are allowed, and that's enforced. And if drug users come and try and sell drugs to these people, the police are there, they're in jail. I mean, they're just hard about it. And but it's that kind of subtlety and differentiation. The irony here is at that council meeting that you watched, the BC housing rep said, and this is quite unbelievable in my view, that the accommodation they're providing, the supportive housing they're providing, they're allowing drug and alcohol use in that building because in that person's, and I'm close to a quote, Housing First is about treating them as clients and having potential access to drugs if they need it. And one of the counselors asked, well, what about people who want a dry house? Oh, no, they have to go there too. Well, that's just not how it works. That's absolutely wrong. Housing First Plus, and certainly in Switzerland and Finland, would just not accept that. If somebody needs special support, special needs in the case of not being exposed to drugs, that's really critical to their future well-being, then they're housed in a place where there are no drugs. And so what I see happening here is that, one, there's just not a willingness to look at Housing First Plus in any kind of detail. Two, we're saying, well, we're already doing Housing First. Well, we're not. We're building housing. Good. The city's building lots of housing with BC Housing. That's great. But it's not all the types required, and it's unfortunately not all the numbers required. And then we need the back end, keeping people housed as well, and a real focus on that. We just don't seem to have the knowledge that they have in Switzerland and Finland. And so what I've been trying to do is bridge that gap, and I've explored, as you know, 55 pages worth of exploration on what they're doing in Switzerland in particular, but I reference Finland. I also reference Medicine Hat, where they've had some success. In November last year, in Medicine Hat, they had 27 people on the street for a population of 63,000. So they're doing something right there. But I understand some people think that maybe they're a bit hard about how they address it. And yes, the province has committed some money to Medicine Hat to do their work. But I'm thinking, well, yeah, but here's a Canadian city that's doing something right. Why aren't we even talking to them or exploring what they're doing? So
I'm curious about maybe the differences between Nanaimo, British Columbia, and some of the other places you're talking about, be it Switzerland or be it Medicine Hat. First of all, in BC, we're in the 8th year of a declared public health emergency because of a toxic drug crisis that's down to fentanyl is in the drug supply. It's my understanding that that isn't really the case in Switzerland. How do you account for that when looking at solutions to this?
Right. But I see that fentanyl is kind of an outcome of all of this because people are in such desperate ways that they're any kind of drug to get them off the street and out of 2 months of rain and soak and cold and miserable lifestyle, right? They're looking for some escape. It's true, fentanyl, it doesn't have the same use in Europe for whatever reason. The other reality is, and I agree 100%, that local governments, municipal governments in Canada are in some ways kind of antiquated for 2024, right? So the country was formed, 80% of the population was rural. Now 80% is urban. And yet the taxation system, governance system is still based on this model that was meant for a very different country than we are today. And I mention that only because when Switzerland formed, it was cantons, they're cities, I call them cantons, came together, 26 of them, to form Switzerland. I think it was 1296 or somewhere in there. And what they came with, their own taxation system. And so they've kept that. So, yes, Basel, which I mentioned earlier, 174,000 people, they have their own income tax. They have corporate tax. So they have way more access to financial resources. There's no question about that. And when I talked to them, they said, Dave, I said, well, how do you deal with, how do you stay on top of the homeless issue? Well, it's not an issue for us because we're able to throw resources at it as required. We don't have to go to anybody to ask. We don't have to go hat in hand to any provincial or federal government and say, please, help us. We just say, we're going to do it ourselves. And they've done it. So the Swiss have a huge advantage there. There's no question. The Finns did all of their homeless response federally. Federal government led that. That's all federal funds there, basically. But in our case, we need provincial and federal government support to be able to make it work. And certainly in Alberta, the provincial government did help Medicine Hat. There's no question about that.
Another important difference, though, between Nanaimo and Medicine Hat is in the last kind of census period, 2016 to 2021, Nanaimo's population grew by about 10%, and Medicine Hat's population grew by about maybe 1%.
Yeah, let's talk about that. That's just a fake discussion, honestly. So 10%, you go, whoa, 10%, but 10% of 100,000 is 10,000 people. Okay, in Medicine Hat grew by 1%, which is like 600. Okay, but 27 people on the street in November in Medicine Hat and 1,000 homeless in Nanaimo. What's wrong with that equation? If you run it backwards, and let's say we've got we never grew. So we're at 94,000. Then we would have 900 people homeless in Nanaimo, running the same numbers that we have. So we can't blame that percentage. It's a huge percentage increase compared to Medicine Hat, but I think it's a false analysis, because Medicine Hat proportionately 27 versus 900 of that instance, it's doing things successfully. So if that's been used twice on me now. Oh yeah, well, we're growing way faster, therefore, our numbers just have to be higher.
Well, not necessarily that it has to be higher, but perhaps some of the pathways into homelessness can be influenced by the housing market having price increases. There's maybe not new housing being created at the same rate as the demand of other people, just normal people looking to move here for jobs. Right. Not necessarily. Right. I know sometimes people talk about, I would love to, if I had to be homeless, I would be homeless on the West Coast because the weather's great. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the idea that lots of people move into a place, maybe there is pressure to build new housing. A phenomenon I've heard about in a lot of Canadian cities is that maybe sometimes older, sort of derelict housing that people have been living in for ages and have these kind of protected, rent-controlled spaces, that gets torn down maybe to build even new housing, and there's no plan for the people living there, and they're pushed into homelessness.
Oh, no, absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more with you. But I'm just addressing that notion that somehow, because we've grown by 10%. I'm addressing the number side. In the case, for instance, in Medicine Hat, they've taken 1,900 people off the street that would have been on the street. 1,900. Like, that's a lot. And are our housing prices higher than Medicine Hat? No question. Has that pushed residents who were, because in point-in-time surveys that are done on the homeless, 71% and 72% in the last two studies had been living in Nanaimo for 5 years, at minimum of 5 years. So that suggests that our fellow citizens are being pushed out on the street. Yeah, that's what you're saying. And I agree. That's a huge issue. It is a huge issue. But that shouldn't be used not to address the problem, because if that's the case, then the problem's only going to get worse. And that's the point I make in my study, that homelessness is increasing at average 20 to 30% a year, which suggests that if we're not able to get those numbers down on the street, we're going to be over 2,000 homeless by 2030.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHLY's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support. Another way to help us out is to share this show with your friends and tell them why they should support us. Finally, if you're listening to the podcast edition of Midcoast Morning, go and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast feed you use. It helps people find us.
Today on the program, I'm speaking with Dave Witty. He sits on the Mayor's Leaders Table and has been exploring the Swiss response to homelessness. At a city council meeting earlier this month, Witty presented council with a 5-point motion that included a call for Nanaimo to create a purpose-driven Housing First Plus position. Now, you presented to city council, and in this process you're on something called the Mayor's Leaders Table. When you've brought this issue up, sometimes people have pointed to, well, Nanaimo has been doing things. We've had this health and housing task force. We've created this new systems planning organization. All of that is within maybe, the last 5 years. Is it something where you feel like we need to give those organizations time, or do you feel like you've seen those, you've observed those processes, and you feel like you don't think they're on the right track necessarily? I've said publicly, and I say in my report, the 2020 study that the city did and is the template for action is a really solid report. I commend it, absolutely. That's 4 years ago now, though.
And I couldn't find any mention of housing first in the report. It's in the appendix as a definition. It's a good definition, but I don't see housing first plus is actually a central part of the action. We're working on the edges, sure. And I've commended the city. Every time I speak to council, I commend the work of staff and their collaboration with BC Housing to build more housing. No question, great work. Lots being provided. But unfortunately, when I apply the housing first plus lens, the variety of housing required. I gave you that example of BC Housing, people in support of housing with perhaps different needs. Not being housing first plus as it's applied in successful countries, that we're in a situation, and the systems planning organization, I commend that in the report. I mean, Basel said that one of the key things for them was to have a similar kind of organization. They called it something different, but empowered to actually look at all aspects of homelessness and coordinate all the delivery requirements, including housing, through to the wraparound supports and the application of the 4 pillars that I mentioned. For me, people here, it's not a case of people saying, we don't want to deal with homelessness. We don't really care about them. People care deeply. I'm just surprised that we don't step back and say, you know what? Maybe we really do need to talk to some of the European countries, some of the cities where they're applying this housing first plus model, and really look at it in detail. Are there lessons? And rather than say, we can't do everything that needs to be done because we're a local government, we don't have the financial resources. You know what? I understand that, but in the absence of I think putting feet to fire in terms of the provincial government in particular and the federal government, then this issue will not be addressed, Joe. It will not be addressed. The resources do not exist. Capability does not exist within the city of Nanaimo and other local governments in British Columbia and Canada, for that matter, to deal with this issue in the absence of significant provincial and federal support. And why wouldn't we? Like, we've got over 250,000 Canadians on the street. Who would have thought Canada would have 250,000 plus of its population living on the streets? That's just absolutely shocking. I would say to you 10 years ago, people would be absolutely livid. But now it's kind of, is it our new normal? And I hope not, but it seems to be moving in that direction. And it doesn't have to be our new normal. Other countries have said, we don't want this as our new normal. We're going to deal with it, and they have.
And in your report, you sort of costed out an estimate of what you think it would take to apply this housing first lens to build housing to meet the needs of people experiencing homelessness in Nanaimo right now. And you've put it at close to $65 million. Yeah. Where, first of all, maybe where do you think that money should come from?
Yeah, so I actually started, before I got to the $65 million, I looked at and estimated what is it costing all levels of government to literally keep people on the street in Nanaimo now. So I ran numbers on that and the table on that, and I think I assumed 800 people, for instance, instead of the 1,000, and then out of that, 600 potentially that are in bad shape that need supports. So I estimated it's costing taxpayers $21 million a year in Nanaimo alone to keep people on the street. No one has contested that. That's been out there since January. And I did the research to identify what are the costs that are identified elsewhere and applied them here. And so, depending on the seriousness of say the drug use of the person who's living on the street or their mental health issues, the number varies, right? So some people don't need a lot of supports because, in fact, perhaps they're sleeping in their van or car and trying to get by on that. So their supports are much less than someone who's overdosing on a regular basis and in emergency on a regular basis. There was a woman about 10 years ago in Surrey documented $175,000 a year it was costing to keep her literally on the street because of how much she used the system to try and stay alive. So I costed out $21 million. No one's disputed that we're spending literally to keep people on the street through ambulance, police, visits to the hospital, emergency, that kind of stuff, all of the supports. So then I thought, what if we actually try to reduce that by building the necessary accommodation and wraparound supports to keep people healthy when they're housed, and on a road to back normal life in society, as it happens for some of them in Switzerland, and I mentioned Italy at 85%. What if we did that? So on the one hand, think of that $21 million decreasing as the money is moved into housing. So over time, you can pay for the housing, the $65 million to build 900 units. 900 units identified the types of units: supportive housing, emergency, seniors housing, families. The whole 900 units should go a long way. Youth. And it is quite detailed. You see that table. And so directing money that's spent on the street eventually into the housing. And so you end up with potential 900 units being built, $65 million in current dollars. But that funding could be over 10 years come out of the money we're already spending on keeping people on the street. So it's reallocating that money over time as you reduce people on the street into housing. We're always going to have people living on the street. That's the nature of the way it is. But I'm assuming maybe 100, but instead of 1,000. But I believe it actually can be significantly funded by redirecting existing money spent on keeping people literally on the street. And I haven't had anybody dispute those numbers.
One thing, though, that's explicitly not included in the numbers is the cost of land. At the same city council meeting,
Correct.
You presented this
Correct.
at. Another issue was a supportive housing building that's being built in the Newcastle neighborhood. And one of the things the neighborhood group was calling for was for the building to be one story smaller, for there to be fewer people. And the BC housing representative pointed to the fact that a challenge with that is that it is just so hard to find land, to find places to build a building like this in Nanaimo. How do we get over that hurdle?
No, you're correct. That's right. And I didn't include housing or the land costs in that because land costs are just all over the map, right? So that's the physical construction of the units. Land costs are always going to be a problem. There's government and city-owned land in the city for sure that potentially could provide a base for some of those units. But I think what I've attempted to do is show that there is an opportunity to fund, and that's redistributing that money from $21 million on the street into the physical form of the housing themselves. There's also the requirement, I think, and it's absolutely essential, I mentioned before, that we need the feds at the table, and they have significant housing funds set aside in the billions for housing, using that to acquire land. If the feds are in it for the land, and the province and the city were in for it in terms of moving the money off the street into the physical units, I think that's a possibility. But again, Joe, in the absence of actually looking at it, like it's just a little old me here has looked at it and put the numbers together, and people say, thanks, Dave, and that's the end of it. Like, somebody needs to step forward and say, let's take a look at this in a serious way. And until we know the real numbers, it's tough to approach other levels of government, right? So, but at least explore, have those conversations. I've reached out to our MLA. I've reached out to our MP. Still waiting. They've certainly got back to me. Said, yep, as they have this general email that gets back and says, "Thank you, we're very busy. We'll try to get back to you." But I hope they do, because I know the mayor has urged that he and I have a conversation with each of our MLA and MP to talk about what are the possibilities here to explore this notion of having a collaborative approach to addressing homelessness.
I know a number of politicians have frequently cited this as the issue they hear the most about, this being visible poverty, homelessness. What do you feel like people who aren't those decision makers, aren't the mayor, aren't the MLA, aren't the MP, what can they do about this if they maybe are feeling the same way you were and just want to see this problem addressed?
Well, I certainly had people say to me, well, there's an election coming, and I think I see this as a potential election issue, but it doesn't seem to be being addressed by politicians. But you're right, it's being addressed. It's being talked about around, and, you get together and have a beer with friends or dinner party, whatever it is. Homelessness is a topic that's often discussed. It's on the minds of people who are going to be voting for governments in the future. And I think politicians would be wise to press this further and do more, I think, in terms of trying to work and collaborate across all levels of government. And, Joe, and I think quite honestly, in 2024, it's a requirement for that, not just addressing homelessness, on all sectors. Like, we are an urban nation with a governance model, as I said, that was designed and built when we were not an urban nation. And we just need to rethink. I think, unfortunately, the system's broken, and we need to revisit that in a significant way. And I see this issue of homelessness as perhaps one of the first most important and issues. And I call it an existential crisis. I really believe it is. And it's just going to get worse unless we bring all of us together, all levels of government, to say we have to try and solve this collectively when we just can't point fingers anymore.
Dave Witty, there's so much more to say on this, but I have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your time too, Joe. Appreciate it.
Dave Witty speaking with me in the CHLY studio. Witty sits on the mayor's leaders table. Earlier this month, he brought a 5-point motion to Nanaimo City Council. It included a call for council to recognize that homelessness in Nanaimo is an existential crisis that must be addressed with a fulsome response. The motion was ultimately referred to Nanaimo's Systems Planning Organization. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Sailor Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Nanaimo First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.